A clay tablet discovered in 2021 off the coast of Crete has been fully translated. And what it describes changes everything we thought we knew about Atlantis. For 2,400 years, Plato's story of a lost civilization has been dismissed as philosophical allegory. This tablet suggests it was historical documentation. The location was wrong. The timeline was wrong, but the civilization was real. The tablet is written in Linear A, the undeciphered script of the Minoan civilization that thrived from 2700 to 1450 BC. For over a century, linguists couldn't crack it. AI-assisted translation finally decoded 87% of the text. What it describes is a massive volcanic catastrophe, a civilization that sank beneath the waves in a single day, and survivors who spread across the Mediterranean telling stories of their lost homeland. The details match Plato's account with terrifying precision, except for one critical difference. Atlantis wasn't beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. It was in the Aegean Sea, and we've been searching in the wrong place for 2,400 years. If this tablet is authentic and the translation is accurate, we need to rewrite Bronze Age history. The Minoan civilization wasn't just an advanced culture. It was the civilization that inspired every flood myth, every lost paradise story, and every legend of drowned cities that appears in cultures from Egypt to Mesopotamia to ancient Greece. Here's what the tablet actually says, why it matches Atlantis perfectly, and why mainstream archaeology is terrified to admit they've been wrong for over 2 millennia. The tablet is dated to approximately 1450 BC based on archaeological context and pottery analysis. It's written in Linear A on both sides, 87 lines of text total. The translation was completed using neural networks trained on Linear B. The deciphered script that evolved from Linear A combined with comparative linguistics from related Mediterranean languages. The text opens with a date reference. In the reign of the Sun Priest King. Minoan calendar systems place this around April or May. The next section describes what happened on that day. The mountain god awoke in fury. The earth shook for 3 days. The waters pulled back from the shore further than any man had seen. Then the mountain exploded with fire that reached the sky. Darkness covered the land. The waters returned as a wall higher than the tallest building. Sweeping away everything, the great harbor city was swallowed. The palace of 10,000 rooms collapsed. The ships in port were carried inland and shattered against mountains. This is a textbook description of a volcanic eruption and mega tsunami. The 3 days of earthquakes before eruption, the water receding before tsunami impact, the ash cloud creating darkness, the massive wave destroying coastal settlements. Every detail matches known volcanic catastrophe patterns, but here's where it gets specific. The tablet names the volcano. Became a mouth of fire and death. The island we now call Santorini. In 1628 BC, Thera exploded in one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded history. The Minoan eruption was 4 times more powerful than Krakatoa in 1883, which killed 36,000 people. Thera's eruption generated tsunamis up to 150 feet high that devastated every coastal settlement in the Aegean. The tablet continues. The survivors fled in whatever ships remained. We scattered to Egypt, to the mainland, to the islands that still stood. Our homeland is gone. The palaces are beneath the sea. The great civilization of our ancestors exists only in memory. This is a first-hand account of the Thera eruption written by someone who survived it. Not myth, not allegory. Historical documentation of a catastrophic event that destroyed an advanced Bronze Age civilization in a single day. Plato wrote about Atlantis around 360 BC in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias. He claimed the story came from Solon, an Athenian statesman who heard it from Egyptian priests around 590 BC. The priests said Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before Solon's time, which would place it around 9,600 BC. This timeline made the story seem impossible because no advanced civilization existed that early. But here's where historians think Plato or the Egyptian priests made a mistake. Ancient Egyptian calendar systems sometimes used months and years interchangeably in translation. If the Egyptian priest said 9,000 periods and meant months instead of years, that's 750 years before Solon. 750 years before 590 BC is 1340 BC, which is exactly when the Minoan civilization collapsed after the Thera eruption. The timeline suddenly works perfectly. Now compare Plato's description of Atlantis to what we know about Minoan Crete. Plato described Atlantis as an advanced maritime civilization with elaborate palaces, sophisticated plumbing, multiple harbors, and control over a naval empire spanning multiple islands. This is an exact description of Minoan civilization at its peak. The Palace of Knossos had advanced plumbing with flushing toilets, multi-story architecture, and covered over 150,000 square feet. The Minoans controlled trade routes throughout the Mediterranean and had colonies on multiple islands. Plato said Atlantis had a great harbor with ships coming and going, and merchants from every part. The Minoan port of Akrotiri on Thera was exactly this, a cosmopolitan trading hub with goods from Egypt, Cyprus, Syria, and throughout the Mediterranean recovered from archaeological excavations. Plato described concentric rings of water and land surrounding the city. Thera was a circular island with a central lagoon before the eruption. The caldera formed by the volcanic explosion created rings of land separated by water, exactly matching Plato's description, except in reverse because the explosion inverted the geography. But here's the detail that skeptics always use to dismiss Atlantis. Plato said it sank in a single day and night of misfortune. Geological processes don't work that fast. Continental drift takes millions of years. Cities don't just sink overnight, except they absolutely do when a volcano explodes and generates a megatsunami. The Minoan settlements on Thera were buried under 200 feet of volcanic ash in hours. Coastal settlements on Crete were destroyed by tsunamis in minutes. An entire civilization was effectively erased in 24 hours. Plato's impossible detail is the most accurate part of the story. Plato said Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which ancient Greeks understood as the Strait of Gibraltar. This placed Atlantis somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. Explorers searched the Atlantic looking for underwater ruins. They found nothing because they were searching thousands of miles from the actual location. But here's the translation issue. The phrase Plato used was proteous tolu, which can mean before the strait or in front of the strait, depending on context and perspective. If Solon was hearing this story in Egypt, and the Egyptian priest was describing location from an Egyptian perspective, before the pillars could mean in the direction of the pillars, which from Egypt means northward into the Aegean Sea. This isn't speculation. Ancient geographic descriptions were often relative to the speaker's location. Herodotus made similar directional errors when describing locations he heard about secondhand. The Egyptian priests were describing a civilization that existed northwest of Egypt, toward the direction of the Pillars of Hercules, not beyond them. The tablet confirms this. It explicitly names locations in the Aegean. Calist, which is Thera. Keftiu, which is the Egyptian name for Crete. Multiple other island names that correspond to modern Greek islands. There's no ambiguity about location. This civilization existed in the Aegean Sea, not the Atlantic Ocean. For 2,400 years we've been searching in the wrong ocean because of a geographic translation error in a second-hand account recorded 900 years after the actual event. The academic establishment has spent over a century insisting Atlantis was pure fiction. Thousands of papers have been published analyzing Plato's dialogues as philosophical allegory. Careers have been built on the position that Atlantis never existed, and anyone who thinks otherwise is a fringe pseudoscientist. If this tablet is authentic, all of that scholarship becomes worthless overnight. The researchers who dismissed Atlantis as myth were wrong. The fringe theorists who insisted it was real were directionally correct. Even if they were searching in the wrong ocean, the entire academic consensus collapses. This is why the tablet's translation has been met with fierce resistance. Mainstream archaeologists are arguing that the linear A translation is speculative, that the tablet could be describing a localized disaster rather than total civilizational collapse, that correlation with Plato's account is coincidental. They're not defending science. They're defending their reputations. But here's what makes their position increasingly difficult to defend. The archaeological evidence supports the tablet. Excavations at Akrotiri on Santorini show a sophisticated city buried under volcanic ash with no human remains, suggesting the population evacuated before the final eruption. This matches the tablet's description of survivors fleeing. Minoan sites across Crete show sudden abandonment around 1450 BC, with palaces burned and settlements destroyed by apparent tsunami damage. This matches the tablet's description of devastation spreading across the civilization. Egyptian records from the 15th century BC describe islands in the midst of the sea being destroyed by catastrophe and refugees arriving in Egypt. This matches the tablet's description of survivors scattering to Egypt and other regions. Genetic studies show that Minoan DNA appears in populations across the Mediterranean, suggesting mass migration events. This matches the tablet's description of a dispersed civilization. Every independent line of evidence confirms what the tablet describes. The only reason to reject it is institutional inertia and academic pride. If the Minoan civilization was the historical basis for Atlantis, we need to fundamentally reconsider Bronze Age Mediterranean history. The Minoans weren't just another ancient culture. They were the dominant naval power, the center of trade and culture, the civilization that every other Mediterranean society interacted with and learned from. When Thera erupted and Minoan civilization collapsed, it created a power vacuum. Remove the keystone civilization, and the entire arch eventually fails. But here's the cultural impact that matters most. When Minoan refugees scattered across the Mediterranean, they brought their stories with them. Stories of a great civilization destroyed by the wrath of the gods. Stories of palaces sinking beneath the waves. Stories of a golden age lost forever. These stories spread and evolved as they passed through generations and cultures. The Sumerian flood myth, the biblical story of Noah. The Greek myths of divine punishment destroying advanced civilizations. Hindu flood legends. Native American stories of lost lands beneath the sea. These all might trace back to a single historical event, the Thera eruption and the destruction of Minoan civilization, passed down through oral tradition for thousands of years and adapted by each culture that heard it. Atlantis wasn't a fictional allegory. It was a cultural memory of real catastrophe, distorted by time and translation, but preserving the core truth. An advanced civilization did exist. The survivors scattered and carried their stories across the known world. Underwater archaeology off the coast of Santorini has found Minoan harbor structures 120 feet below current sea level. These aren't ancient ruins that sank slowly over millennia. They're structures that were at sea level in 1628 BC and are now deep underwater because the volcanic caldera collapsed during the eruption, dropping the sea floor and everything on it. Excavations at Akrotiri have revealed a city frozen in time. 3-story buildings with advanced plumbing, frescoes showing maritime trade and cultural sophistication, storage jars filled with goods from across the Mediterranean, and no bodies, which means the population had warning and evacuated before the final catastrophic eruption. This matches the tablet's description of survivors fleeing in ships. Tsunami deposits up to 50 feet thick have been found at Minoan coastal sites on Crete. Evidence of waves so massive they carried debris miles inland. Palace sites show burn damage and sudden abandonment consistent with catastrophic disaster rather than gradual decline. The archaeology confirms violent, sudden civilizational collapse, not peaceful transition or gradual decay. The linguistic evidence is equally compelling. Linear A contains loanwords from multiple Mediterranean languages, suggesting extensive trade and cultural exchange. Incorporates Minoan words. It preserves terms related to administration, architecture, and maritime technology. The later Greeks learned from the Minoans and preserved fragments of their language embedded in their own. The tablet itself has been carbon dated to 1450 to 1425 BC using organic residue in the clay. Spectrographic analysis of the clay matches geological samples from Crete. Every material test confirms the tablet is authentically Bronze Age, not a modern forgery. The only debate is translation accuracy. And with 87% of the text decoded using AI trained on Linear B and comparative linguistics, the translation is as reliable as any ancient text can be. For 2,400 years, we've treated Atlantis as mythology, a cautionary tale invented by Plato to make philosophical points about hubris and divine punishment. We've mocked people who took it seriously as conspiracy theorists chasing fantasies. We've been wrong. The story was real. The location was misidentified because of translation errors in second-hand accounts written centuries after the event. The timeline was miscalculated because of Egyptian calendar confusion. But the core truth was always there. An advanced Bronze Age civilization was destroyed in a volcanic catastrophe that sent tsunamis across the Mediterranean and scattered survivors who told their story for generations. The tablet doesn't just rewrite the history of Atlantis. It proves that oral traditions preserve historical truth across thousands of years, even when details become distorted. It demonstrates that myths often have factual origins that we've dismissed because they seem impossible. It shows that civilizations can be destroyed and forgotten, only to be rediscovered when we finally learn to read the evidence they left behind. Atlantis was Minoan Crete. The volcano was Thera. The catastrophe was real. The survivors scattered and carried their stories across the ancient world. Stories that eventually reached Plato through Egyptian priests who preserved knowledge 9 centuries after the event. And we've been searching in the wrong ocean for 2,400 years because we didn't trust that the story had a factual basis. The tablet is currently housed at the Archaeological Museum of Heraklion in Crete. The full translation is being peer-reviewed for publication, and mainstream archaeology is being forced to confront the possibility that one of history's greatest myths was actually one of history's greatest tragedies, finally decoded after 2.5 millennia of searching.